Hello everybody, my name is Brandon. Welcome back to the channel. I'm here today with my January 2021 reading wrap-up video. This is where I share with you guys everything that I finished in the month of January. And last month, I ended up doing 7 books and 1 graphic novel, so a total of 8 different items to talk about today. I did a ton of audiobooks as well, which I always love doing. But anyway, I will talk to you guys about my thoughts on the books at the beginning, and then at the end of this video, we will jump over to some January statistics, which I love sharing statistics, so hopefully you guys are looking forward to those. So we have 8 different items to talk about today, so let's not waste any time at all. Let's dive right in. As always, I will go through these in the order that I finished them. So the first one I completed in January was a graphic novel called These Savage Shores, written by Ram V and Sumit Kumar. So this one is actually labeled as like volume 1, but I believe this is the entire story. I don't think there are any other issues past this volume 1. And if there are, like, this is a self-contained story. So even if there is, it might be different characters. I don't know. It's hard to say. But so this was one that has been on my to-read list for quite some time now. It came out in 2019, and by the end of the year, it was ending up on a ton of, like, best of the year lists. And it looked like something I would probably enjoy. So I tried getting it from my library, like, throughout all of 2020. It just wasn't happening. And then finally, at either I think it was the very tail end of last year, I was able to finally place a hold on it, so I was able to get this one. And I'm really glad that I held out for the library version, or, you know, to borrow it as opposed to buying it, because while this is a good story and I definitely appreciated it, I don't think it's one I will revisit, so I'm glad I'm glad I saved the money and didn't purchase it. So to give a plot of this one is really difficult because it took me like a few issues to really kind of grasp what was going on here. But basically, like, this vampire is exiled to India, and we are following like the East India Company as they are making their trek up this, I think it's called like the Silk Shore, the Silk Road, something like that. Basically this vampire becomes a part of it, and the vampire comes in contact with this other like mythical creature, and things kind of take off from there. Like I said with this one, it did take me a couple issues to really like get some momentum going with my interest in the story, but I will say the ending of both issues 1 and issue 2 were good enough that I wanted to keep going, and I'm glad I did, because the final 2 issues, like basically like the finale of it, the conclusion of it, I thought was really interesting and done really well. This is a very bloody, kind of like brutal horror story mixed with like this mythological creature that is in the story, along with like the vampire mythos. So I think it was really interesting in that sense. I loved the combination of these 2 creatures, and just like you think one is just like as bad as it gets, and then the other one pops up and just like just kind of like, you know, causes mayhem, and it's like, oh my gosh, like the drawing in this, the art style was wonderful. It was so beautiful to look at, and I think that's what really kept me going throughout those first 2 issues, was because I felt like with this excellent art style that there was something that was worth reading here, or that we would eventually get to something that was worth reading. And I really feel like, you know, from issues 3 on, it was really the case. This one was good, not great, because the entire run I didn't think was awesome. Just those final 2 issues, the conclusion, where the story goes. But I really feel like it doesn't kind of pick up into that arc, into that story, until you really get to issue 3. The first 2 issues are kind of backstory on, you know, this is our vampire and why he's here type of thing, and then it really takes off with like that mythical creature. Now, don't get me wrong, that mythical creature is there the entire time, but he doesn't really come into his own until later in the series, I guess I'll say. So this was one that was good, and I'm really glad I ended up borrowing this from the library to read it. But I don't think it's going to end up on like a best of the year list come the end of this year. So while I liked it, I didn't love it. I still ended up giving These Savage Shores Volume 1 by Ram V and Sumit Kumar 4 out of 5 stars. Moving from a mythological horror over to a real-life horror, we have a true crime book here. This is called Lost Girls, An Unsolved American Mystery, and this is written by Robert Kolker. So I ended up doing this one on audiobook because I own it on Audible, but I really feel like I may have been better served doing this one in the physical form, which I don't normally say, but the reason I feel that with this one is just because of the way the book was structured. So this is the story of the hunt for the Long Island serial killer, but in reality, it's more about like 5 to 8 of his victims that are known victims, at least, because he is believed to have killed about 10 to 16 people in a 20-year time span, and most of them were prostitutes. That was his MO. So we are following like the main players here. There's about 5 to 8 women that we're following mostly, and the author goes into just exhaustive detail on these women, which is great. That is fantastic. These are all important lives that should never have been taken from us as early as they were. And it's important to remember that. Like, this is what all these true crime stories should be about, are these victims that we lost too soon. And Kolker does a great job with that. The only problem, though, is that with the audiobook version, I wasn't able to flip back to see who he was talking about, because so many of these women's stories were so familiar to one another, so similar to one another. Most of them came from difficult backgrounds, broken homes, things like that. They got into prostitution at a young age. They dealt with drugs. Like, they had very similar backgrounds for the most part. So trying to remember, the names, for me at least, was pretty difficult, and I had a hard time remembering who he was talking about as the story progressed. Kolker does a really good job of shining a positive light on the sex worker industry, which is so important for this book, because that's what these women, that's what they did. And frankly, that's probably why so many of these women took so long to discover, because nobody was looking for them. And so it's just like an incredibly sad story here. And the only real negative I can say about the book is just the structure of the story, or the structure of how the story was told was done in such a way that it was difficult for me to keep track of who he was talking about. Now, something else he does is he keeps his opinion out of it almost exclusively. He does talk about kind of like 3 of the major players that were not victims, that were just kind of a part of specifically Shannon's story, who's kind of our main player here that kind of drives the entire story. That's who helped the police discover the first set of victims. So she's our kind of our main character, if you will, in this. But even though he's talking about these people who could very well be, obvious suspects, he doesn't really paint them as such. He does have a chapter that highlights theories on what could have happened, but he only talks about other people's theories. He doesn't really talk about his own, which I don't know that I loved that. That's going to be great for some readers. I just don't know if I'm one of those readers that likes that. I would have loved to have some type of not necessarily a conclusion, because obviously it's an unsolved mystery, but some idea of what at least this person, who has probably spent more time than anybody else, excluding the families or the police that are working this investigation, someone who has spent that much time on this, I would love to hear their opinion on what he believes happened, and that's unfortunately missing here. So I did end up giving this one 3.5 out of 5 stars, but that really doesn't mean anything. The story of these women is worth knowing. They were important people. They had families. They had lives that they were living. Just because they were sex workers does not make them any lesser. So this is definitely a story worth knowing and reading. And though I gave it 3.5 stars, this is often cited as one of the top books in the true crime field. So, if it is a field that you're interested in, definitely check it out. And honestly, this one I might recommend reading in the physical form, just because it would be easier to jump back and forth so that you can remember exactly who he's talking about, unlike me, who, it was a little bit more difficult to do that. So, like I said, this is a good book, worth knowing for sure, and I'm glad that I read it. But I did end up giving Lost Girls by Robert Kolker 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is Run by Blake Crouch. So my experience with Blake Crouch was very positive in the past. I read Dark Matter by him, and that was one of my favorite books that I read in 2019. It was fantastic. So I honestly, I didn't even realize this was Blake Crouch heading into it. I knew the author, but I wasn't making the connection between Dark Matter and the author's name. So coming into it, I didn't have high expectations. This one I did on audiobook, again, because I bought it on Audible recently. It was really cheap. I think it was a deal of the day, maybe. Or, oh, no, it was one that I owned the ebook for. And so in order to get the Audible narration, it was only $1.99. So I ended up picking it up. And I'm glad I did. This was a fun book. So with Run, we are basically in this, what feels like a post-apocalyptic world. That's the type of book that you're going to be reading here. So 5 days ago, something happened. This event happened. And all of a sudden, these crazy murders started happening. They seem, unrelated, crazy, bizarre murders. And that's sweeping its way across the country. Well, whatever it is, these people are now just bloodthirsty, and they are killing anyone and everyone that gets in their way, except for a select group of people. And I don't want to talk about too much with that, because that kind of gives spoilers, so I'll leave it there. But we are following this family of 4. It is, the dad, the mom, and then the younger son and the older teenage daughter, as they are essentially leaving their house. They're forced out of their house because they know that people are on their way to kill them. So they leave their house and trying to make their way across the country. I guess they're, trying to get away from there, basically. And they are faced with everything you would typically see in like a post-apocalyptic world where people are trying to kill them as they are trying to survive. It was funny, like, I think the apocalyptic aspects of this really came in quickly. Like the power grid went out super fast, like within days, which doesn't seem super realistic. One thing that cracked me up is that there's like a specific mention that when they go into a like a liquor or a grocery store or something, the only thing left is toilet paper. And like that made me laugh because, oh, Blake, you had no idea. But as we know now, having lived through this pandemic and continuing to live through this pandemic, the first thing that goes is toilet paper. So that part made me laugh out loud, and it's just interesting to see like a pandemic world now having lived through it and continue to live through it. So that part was fun. Basically what we're doing here is seeing if this family is going to survive or not and see how far they can make it, and along the way they have all these crazy encounters with these different people that are trying to kill them. This is just the equivalent of a throwaway action movie but done in book form. Like, it's fun, I enjoyed it, but there's not a lot of depth here, so don't expect a lot of character growth or anything like that. The finale, so like right at the beginning of this book, you are just thrown right into the action and things are going, which is great because it keeps the pace up. And I finished this in like 24 hours, I think. Like, it was super quick for me to finish, which it's a short book. I want to say like the audiobook is like 7.5 hours or something like that. So it's a very short book, but for me, finishing it in 24 hours was, notable because I don't normally read them that quickly, but I just wanted to know where this was going to go. And as quickly as it picked up, it kind of ends just as abruptly, which was a little bit disappointing. So I didn't love the finale of this, but I think the meat in the middle is, good enough that it makes it fun to read. So while this is just a far cry from Dark Matter, which is just a phenomenal book, this one was just fine. Like, it was good. I enjoyed it, but I don't really think I need to read it again type of thing. Like, it was fine. It is what it is. So I ended up giving Run by Blake Crouch 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is another audiobook that I finished last month, and this is another one I picked up in January, specifically for my, Star Wars canon reading order. This was first on the list. This is called Catalyst, a Rogue One novel written by James Luceno, or Luceno, however you say that. So this is basically the catalyst, or the prequel for Rogue One. We are basically learning how Jyn... Well, actually, we're learning how Jyn's parents probably raised her in order to get to where we get to in Rogue One. So I've only seen Rogue One once in theaters when it came out, and I really enjoyed it, but one thing I remember about that movie was that I just couldn't remember the characters. They seemed a little generic to me when I first watched it, but going back to this now and kind of seeing Jyn's parents and how that story has worked itself out, it has me really excited to watch Rogue One yet again, which I plan to do this month if you guys watch my TBW video, but I haven't got to it yet in the month, but I definitely will. So like I said, this is basically the story of Jyn's parents. Jyn is a baby in this book until like toddler age, I believe. As the story progresses a little bit, she might be a child, I guess. I can't remember exactly how old she is by the end of this, but she's talking and things like that. So it's not her it's not in the lead up directly before Rogue One, but a few years beforehand. There is actually a YA story that is from like the end of this novel to the beginning of Rogue One. I don't know if I'm going to read that one right now. I might go back to it at the end. But the other thing I really liked about this novel is that you get a lot of Tarkin in here, which has always been an interesting character to me, but I don't know too much about at all. So it was really cool to see that, and it almost makes me want to add Tarkin, the book Tarkin, to my reading list. But that's another one I think I'll probably add at the end if I get to the end, which I hopefully will at some point, and then I can come back and read it. So this is one that took a little bit for me to kind of get into because I wasn't sure who these characters were exactly. Like, I consider myself a big Star Wars fan, but I don't know nearly enough of the characters' names or locations. Like, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I've only really come into my Star Wars fandom kind of hardcore over the last couple years here, so I'm still even catching up with the movies. Like, I'm not fully caught up yet. So while I do like what I've consumed so far in this universe, I have so much more to go to really consider myself a true like Star Wars fanatic. So that said, it was a little more difficult for me to kind of place what was going on just at the beginning of this, but as the story progressed, the story of Jin's parents, that human story, was really what kept bringing me back into it. I really loved their story. They are fascinating characters, which makes sense because they birthed this incredible, this incredible woman who goes on to basically create the entire Star Wars universe as we know it, which is awesome. So, it was a really interesting read, and this is one that the audiobook on this, because it is one of those canon audiobooks from the Star Wars universe, it has like full production value. Not only was the narrator just fantastic, but there's also music in this, which is really cool, and it's your familiar Star Wars theme. So I really like that about it. I will mention though, at some points I feel like the mixing could have been done a little bit better because I was not losing, but it was just a little bit more difficult to hear some of the dialogue when the music was being turned up. So that part was a little like, maybe we could fix that a little bit. But really, I think it does very little to distract from it, though. It's really cool to have that music in there, and I really like that aspect of it. The story itself, I think, was really interesting. Though it's not like this hugely climactic tale at the end, I do like where it goes. You kind of have these gray characters, they might seem like they're villains or they're good people at the beginning, but there's so much more to them, which I really enjoyed. Like, there's no pure good, pure evil in this, which I really like. There's definitely a lot of gray area, which was really fun to read, and I always think that makes for the most interesting characters, and that definitely holds true here. So I like this one. I'm really excited to continue on. The next book I will read is going to be Last Shot, which is like a Han Solo adventure. I think it's actually Solo and Lando Calrissian, so that one should be a lot of fun. But first I have to watch Rogue One, and then I have to watch Solo, and then I will get to that next book. So that's the goal for February, but excited to continue on in the series because I've enjoyed every Star Wars book I've read so far. So really happy to be reading these and can't wait to see where it takes me. So I ended up giving Catalyst, a Rogue One novel by James Luceno, 4 out of 5 stars. Next up on my list was one that will actually help me with my media goals for 2021, and this is the BFI Film Classics book, Back to the Future. This one was written by Andrew Shail and Robin Stoate. So I was really excited to read this. I have like 3 of these BFI Film Classic books. I have the Back to the Future one, I think I have Night of the Living Dead, and then Big Lebowski, if I'm remembering right. I think those are the 3 I own, but after reading this one, I don't know how terribly excited I am to get to the next 2, because this one was a slog. This is a very academic look at the Back to the Future film. It doesn't really talk about the sequels too terribly much. In fact, it like talks in like the first chapter how this is a book about the first movie, not the sequels, but it does reference them here and there as you go on. But there wasn't too much here that I really enjoyed. Like, this is a short book. It's only like 106 pages is the last page here. But it took me like 3 weeks to get through this because it just was boring. I had such a boring time with this. If you are looking for a very, classroom academic approach to Back to the Future, then yeah, this is something you would probably be interested in. But I wanted to know more of like the behind the scenes things, or kind of, I don't know, just I didn't want to know all of the things it talked about here. And the other thing that kills me is that it makes so many assumptions about what the director, about what Zemeckis was trying to do and what the writer was trying to do with different things, that at some points it just gets a little ridiculous. Like, I guess I can't cite a specific example right now without thinking about it too hard, but I don't know, it was just so boring. Like, I do like that there's the pictures throughout, things like that. I thought there were some parts that were interesting, talking about how like race plays a part in the film. The Oedipal, how you say that? Oedipus Rex, so I guess it's Oedipal complex or syndrome that's going on here between Marty's mother being attracted to him and how he handles that, so that incestual relationship of sorts. Like, I don't know, those were kind of interesting, but so much of this was just not as interesting as that. So I would definitely recommend just watching some of like the documentaries on Back to the Future, because you're going to get a lot more interesting information that way. Information that, you can use in trivia, things like that. That's what I enjoy about, watching those behind the scenes documentaries. But with this, there's just, I'm not writing a paper on Back to the Future. I'm not teaching a class on Back to the Future. I simply love the movie Back to the Future, and I wanted to know more about it. And this dove into it in a way that wasn't really for me. So while this definitely has an audience, I was for sure not that audience. So take that for what you will. I ended up giving the BFI Film Classics book Back to the Future by Andrew Shail and Robin Stoate 2 out of 5 stars. The next book I finished also helps me with my 2021 media goals, and that is Shock Value, written by Jason Zinoman. And you can see the subtitle here, How a Few Eccentric Outsiders Gave Us Nightmares, Conquered Hollywood, and Invented Modern Horror. So that's really what this book is. It's from it really covers like 1968 to about 1980, and the horror genre in those years. Our main players here, we're talking about Wes Craven, John Carpenter, Dan O'Bannon, who frankly is not portrayed in a really positive light. He kind of comes off as like a whiny crybaby of sorts, a little bitter at John Carpenter because they were like really close friends in film school, and then some things happened and they kind of separated. He seemed a little bitter. Like, I don't know if that's really how he was, but that's how Zinoman has him written here, at least. That's how he's portrayed here. So I thought that was interesting because I know very little about O'Bannon, and so now this is what I know, so I don't know. Obviously, he's an incredibly talented man, so, you can't take that away from him. But yeah, this was, I thought, really well done. Like, there were some things in here that I learned that I had no idea previously. Again, like that relationship between Carpenter and O'Bannon. I didn't even know they were friends, which, to be fair, if you're a huge horror junkie, you probably know 75% of what's in this book. But I love horror, but I hadn't spent a lot of time like behind the scenes, I guess, at least as much as Jason Zinoman has. And so I learned quite a bit from this book, but that is obviously going to vary based on you, so take that with a grain of salt. One thing that was really kind of annoying in this was just how spoiler heavy it was. Like, right at the beginning, he is spoiling Rosemary's Baby. If you haven't seen it, don't read this. Some other ones I can remember him spoiling were The Exorcist 3. He spoils that. Targets from 1968, I believe. He spoils that film. Like, they're Aliens, or Alien rather. There are just so many in here that he completely spoils. So make sure you have a good background in the horror genre before you come into this one. Like, I would say probably 90% of the movies he talks about in here I had already seen, so I wasn't too worried about the spoilers. But like Targets, I haven't. That's one that's been on my list for a long time, and I just never seen it, so I had to like skip through some portions of that. Exorcist 3 is another one I hadn't seen, so there are some in here that I hadn't, but a lot of them though I had, so I was okay for the most part. But I will mention I did this one on audiobook. This was available on Hoopla, so I ended up borrowing it that way, even though I've owned this version of the book for the longest time. I ended up doing the audiobook route. But it does talk a bit about like William Castle and how he helped usher in this new modern horror age with his work as a producer on Rosemary's Baby, which was directed by Roman Polanski, another one that gets spoiled in this. So yeah, this was interesting. I thought this was well done. It's not the deepest dive you're going to take into the horror genre, and it only covers a very specific set of years, 1968 to about 1980. It does cover like 1980 to today, or whenever this was written. I think like 2016, I think this was released. But it talks about it in like a chapter, not even a full chapter. It just rushes through it. Like, it mentions like Eli Roth in there at points. Like, it just it touches it very, very lightly. So definitely know that coming into it, what era it's talking about here. So if you're interested in that era and you don't know as much as you'd like, check this out. But if you are incredibly well versed in the horror genre and all of its players, you might not get out as much out of this as I did. But I really enjoyed it. I'm glad I finally read this. It has been on my list for ages now, so I like this one quite a bit. Shock Value, written by Jason Zinoman, I ended up giving 4 out of 5 stars. Next up is Animorphs, book number 6, The Capture, written by K.A. Applegate. So I finally am continuing on in the Animorphs series. I don't know if I talked about book number 5, because there were a couple months there where I didn't do a book wrap-up because I was caught up in so many other things, but book number 5 kind of blew me away. Like, it was awesome. My favorite book in the series by far. I loved it. So book number 6, it kind of took me a minute to remember what was going on in book 5, but then when it clicked, it all clicked again, and I was like, oh my god, that's right. This is where we're going now. But so we're back at basically kind of went through all of our main characters, and we're back at Jake again, who is where this series opened up with. He's kind of the leader of the pack, basically. The story of Animorphs in general is basically an alien species has come down and started taking over people's brains, basically. And these group of kids ended up getting this ability from a good alien in order to turn into animals. It can morph into animals, hence the name Animorphs. And so that's what we're dealing with here, just in case you didn't know what Animorphs was about. But this one I thought was pretty good. It was not nearly as good as the first book in the series, which Jake stars in. It was one that didn't push the plot forward as much as I hoped it would, especially after book number 5. But I still enjoyed the story that was being told here. So I definitely, am still interested in continuing this because I think it's just a fun series. I did like the audiobook narration. I thought they did a wonderful job. So I'm really excited to continue on these first 10 audiobooks. So I have, 7 through 10 to do in audiobook form. And then, of course, I'll just pick up with the physical versions. But I'm excited to get to these because I'm really enjoying this so far. So excited to see where book number 7 takes us. So I ended up giving The Capture by K.A. Applegate 3.5 out of 5 stars. The final book that I want to talk about today is called Night of the Mannequins, written by Stephen Graham Jones. So this is one that I'd heard about thanks to, I think it was like a Books and Lala video. So basically with this one, we are following a group of friends who are deciding to play a prank on one of their other friends who works at a movie theater. So they have this mannequin that they found in a dumpster a handful of years prior, and they decide to structure it in such a way that it looks like a human. And so they put it down in one of the seats of the theater and they sit in the back and wait to see what happens. Well, at the end of the movie, the mannequin gets up and walks out. At least that's what our main character thinks he sees. And so then it just takes off from there. And oh boy, does this book go in places I did not expect. This is really I want to call it almost like a psychological horror because there is so much here that is just not what you expect, or at least not what I expected. You're going along in this book, it's fine, you're like, yeah, this is a good book, this is entertaining, it's kind of lighthearted for the most part, and then all of a sudden it just takes this dark turn. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was really surprised that this book went the places that it did, but I'm so glad it does because it's very interesting to read. I really enjoyed following our main character. It's one of those things where, is he right? Is he wrong? Is it in his head? What did he really see at the theater? Are the things he's saying true? Is there this giant kaiju mannequin out there? It's just bonkers, but it's done so well. Jones has such a good grasp of these characters and just this kind of life that they're living. I thought it was really well done. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I thought this was one I was actually going to have to finish in February, but I ended up wrapping it up on the last day of the month after I filmed my February TBR video. So I mentioned that I was not going to be able to finish it, but I did end up getting through the last couple chapters because I was really interested in how this one was going to end. And while I don't think the ending was quite as strong as the rest of the book, I still think it works well, and it completed the story that he was trying to tell. So, it's good for that. But yeah, this one was definitely one I recommend, and it's really short. It was only 100 and maybe 150-ish pages. It was quite a short book, so I definitely recommend picking this one up if you can. Just for reference, I did end up borrowing this one from my library, so I've done quite a few from my library between January and February here, which is always a good thing in my book. But yeah, I enjoyed this one. I definitely recommend it. I ended up giving Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones 4 out of 5 stars. And that is going to wrap up all of the books I read in January. So now let's talk about some statistics. All right, so I'll put the stats up here on the screen so you guys can see them with me. So in January, I ended up doing 5 audiobooks and 3 physical books, which 4 of them were from my collection and 4 of them were borrowed either via Hoopla or the library, whatever the case may be. I used 3 books on my Audible collection, 2 from Hoopla, 2 from the library, and 1 from my physical collection, which was the BFI Film Classics book of Back to the Future. My audience, I read 7 adult books this month and only 1 middle grade, which really shocked me because I am such a big middle grade reader that I was very surprised I only finished 1 last month. But that's good. I'm glad to get these adult books in. So for genre breakdown, I ended up doing 3 horror books, 2 reference or nonfiction books, 2 sci-fi, and 1 true crime book. I ended up completing 1,860 pages in January and listened to 43 hours and 4 minutes of audiobooks. So just for reference, if this is the first time you're watching, the total pages is across all 8 books that I finished. If I did it on audiobook, I just go to like whatever the popular book is on Goodreads and take that page count. So I have a total page count number. But for the listening time, I only count the audiobooks. So just on the, 5 audiobooks I did, there were 43 hours and 4 minutes there, which is really cool. So the average pages per book that I completed was 233 pages. And then the average pages I read per day was 60, which is pretty good. Like if I'm above 50, I'm happy. I would really like to be at like 75 or more, but hey, if I'm above 50, that's a good thing in my book. So just some miscellaneous stats now. My average rating for January was 3.56 stars, which is pretty good. It took me on average 7.62 days to complete a book, and really I think it was Back to the Future. I think it took me like 21 days, so that one really skewed the average there, unfortunately. So for my highest rated this month was a little weird because 4 of the 8, so half of them, I ended up giving 4 stars, but nothing higher than a 4-star book, and then only 1 ended up being 2 stars, which of course was Back to the Future, the BFI Film Classics book. So those were my stats for January 2021. I always like stats, and I hope you guys do too. But that is going to do it for today, guys. So let me know down in the comments below, have you read any of these? And if you have, what was I right about? What was I wrong about? Which did you love that I hated, and vice versa? Let me know that down in the comments below. I love having more of a conversation with you guys down there. As always, if you guys did enjoy this video, please consider subscribing to Cinefessions here on YouTube. And if not, well, thank you for watching this one. I really do appreciate that. And like I always say, I don't just talk books, I talk all things media, be it books, movies, graphic novels, collectibles, video games. If it's media related, I'm interested in it, and if you are too, you might consider subscribing. Alright guys, so that's going to do it for today. I just want to say thank you all so much for watching, and I want to encourage you to consume some media today. I'll catch you next time.